Death Ball, Roller, Destroyer Droid, Wheel Droid, these are all about it, or her, about the Droideka. Hello, friends. Yes, today's story is about the Droideka, a droid that struck fear into the ranks of the Grand Army of the Republic and even the Jedi. Although, to be fair, the Droideka wasn't the deadliest combat machine in the Separatist arsenal. Before and during the war, megacorporations possessed numerous dangerous droids capable of walking, driving, and swimming. These robots, called droids, were armed and ready for combat. For example, the IG-100 Magna Guard from Holowan Mechanicals, the A-series assassin droids by Pollux Poi, and especially the commando droids from the same colicoids who created the Droideka, and also the powerful Scorponok Annihilator droid, also produced by the colicoids. But all these walking combat machines were a rarity on the battlefield and seldom fell within the sights of the clone troopers' rifles. Or rather, the clones themselves rarely became victims of their guns. Only some exceptionally unlucky units encountered them. But the Droidekas were relatively mass-produced in the Separatist military-industrial complex. They were encountered regularly, and thus no other piece of scrap metal made such an impression on the clones, and no other machine so often burned holes in their armor. The Droideka was also memorable and beloved by fans of the galaxy far, far away. After all, what kind of droids did we mostly see in Star Wars before the first episode? Anthropomorphic or humanoid? 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, sometimes even capable of some thought. And here we were rolled out quite literally a machine of an unusual design not previously seen in science fiction. The Droideka looked unique even at the sketch and concept art stage, and in the film it looked simply magnificent. By the way, you do know that nothing in Star Wars ever just disappears, right? Everything finds a use. Based on early Droideka concepts, this ugly walking tin can with guns, the LR-57 combat droid, was created. But our story today is not about that. In today's video, I'll try to tell you in as much detail as possible about the history of the Droideka's creation, its design, combat use, and the fate of the Droidekas after the Clone Wars. The latter topic is especially interesting to me personally. It's fascinating to know in whose hands the echo of war eventually ended up, and who it fought for. The Droideka has an interesting post-war history, an interesting droid in every respect. Before I tell you about the most dangerous piece of scrap metal in the droid army, I need to say a few words about the creators of the Droideka, who they are, where they came from, and what makes them unique. This is important because the colicoids created the Droidekas in their own image. Well, roughly like gods creating humans in many world religions. The creators of the Droideka were cunning minds with playful hands, sharp claws, and voracious jaws from a company called Colicoid Creation Nest. Who are the colicoids? They are an insectoid race from the planet Coli 4, located in the eponymous planetary system of an unnamed sector, Grid N9. Due to the similarity in name and insect-like origins, the colicoids are often confused with the Killiks, but they are a completely different race, and an even more fascinating one. Oh, how we loved all the quests related to them in the amazing game Star Wars: The Old Republic. But let's not get sidetracked. The colicoids are very large, predatory, bloodthirsty, incredibly resilient, and exceptionally intelligent insects, although, to be honest, they don't really resemble typical insects. The colicoids managed to survive not only on their inhospitable planet, they thrived on cold planets, worlds with high volcanic activity, and even places with extremely toxic atmospheres. This was all thanks to their tough, chitinous armor and unique metabolism. In Star Wars: The Old Republic, the colicoids were living quite well among the toxic and radioactive ruins of the planet Balmorra, in areas where a human could die after just a few breaths of the air. Well, assuming they weren't scared off first by the crackling Geiger counter. On Balmorra, the colicoids were first experimented on by the Republic, and later the Imperials found uses for them on the battlefield. I'm referring to Project Hexapod, but neither side succeeded in creating a living weapon. To all the predatory instincts and resilience of the colicoids, we should add their exceptional fertility. Even from a single hive queen, hundreds of colicoids can hatch in a year. Moreover, a 5-year-old colicoid is very dangerous and quite aware of what it's doing and who it's eating. Colicoids reach maturity at 8 years old, however, they also age quickly. A colicoid is considered old at 50 and few live past 65. With all these starting conditions, one might think the colicoids would remain brainless predators. But nature decided that these insects needed to develop intelligence. First, to survive on their home planet, where predators even more dangerous than themselves existed, and later, to avoid frequently killing each other in internecine wars over resources, and to start finding ways to communicate between hives. Eventually, a complex hierarchy emerged among the hives and a semblance of statehood. Even before the Great Galactic War between the Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic, the colicoids had already established factories, research complexes, and test ranges on their home planet and mastered spaceflight, beginning to trade with nearby races. Well, except for those they devoured, eating random passers-by, and sometimes even their trading partners, became a nasty but tasty habit for the colicoids. Another habit was organizing competitions for the warriors of their customers. Here you go, folks, an arena. Fight among yourselves and sometimes with us. Whoever wins, we trade with. Whoever loses, we eat. Few would want to deal with the colicoids after learning the terms of the deal, if it weren't for their excellent weapons, outstanding military equipment, and especially their very high-quality combat droids, their designs and manufacturing capabilities. The colicoids' droids were, of course, expensive, but very powerful and impressive. Their model range has always been striking. Long before the droidekas, the colicoids were making similar walking combat machines. The distant ancestor of the droideka, the Sith Empire's first model combat droid, the Sith War Droid Mark I, was created with the colicoids drawing inspiration from their own anatomy. You've seen this magnificent and beautiful war machine in the Star Wars, the Old Republic trailers. There was also a second model, the Mark II, and the great-grandfather of the Droideka was the TZ-27 combat droid. The DK-27 droid shows little resemblance to the Droideka, but the similarity to other colicoid creations is very apparent. The next product of the shadowy colicoid mind is called the T4 turret droid. Very expensive, but a very cool walking turret. Although in our opinion it would be better described as a walking tank, or another colicoid toy, known only as the Hunter-Seeker droid. While the Republic and Sith Empire were passionately fighting each other in a series of large-scale wars, the colicoids were delighted selling weapons to both sides. But when the Sith Empire finally exhausted itself and collapsed, and the Republic entered a brief period of relative peace, the colicoids began to lose markets, ultimately losing many hard-won positions in the galactic arms market. Even in the next massive and very prolonged conflict, known as the New Sith Wars, which began with another great schism in the Jedi Order, the fourth in history, and continued with small breaks for the next 1,000 years, the colicoids did not stand out much, although those were exciting times, you know. And it all started as always. A group of Jedi disagreed with the rest of the Order on the opinions and methods of their sorcery. They argued that some things were forbidden, certain knowledge was restricted, and other practices were the dark side. In the end, Phineas, who later called himself Darth Ruin, took a small group of his like-minded comrades and left before the Orthodox Jedi, his recent colleagues, could kill him. Then he founded his own empire. This led to a series of wars, first local and then global. During this lively era, the colicoids occasionally sold their battle droids, blasters, guns, and other equipment to small clients in small batches, but otherwise tried not to stand out. And rightly so, as the saying goes, the quieter you go, the further you'll get. The colicoids had their own term for isolation, but they chose not to share it with us. By the time of the events we are interested in, the appearance of the Droideka, the colicoids were still sitting quietly and not making noise. They rarely received guests. More precisely, they often received them, but they ate them. Because of this, the Galactic Republic Senate refused to send its representatives, senators, or even Jedi Knights to the Cola system. When requests for help poured in from this region, the Republic Senate responded with nothing, as usual. They expressed deep concern, demanded peaceful resolutions to conflicts. What else could the Republic say to their bloodthirsty neighbors in the galaxy? Later, when the clone army appeared, and then the Imperial forces, the colicoids were taught not to eat just anyone they caught, and were nearly put on starvation rations. All the Republic could do at that time was recommend steering clear of the ravenous insects. The fact of the region's isolation, and such an unpleasant reputation, was one of the main reasons why the Trade Federation chose the colicoids to create certain combat machines for their secret droid army, primarily the droidekas. Negotiations took quite a while. The trade delegations, consisting of humans and Nemoidians, were almost eaten by the colicoids according to their usual habit. But the traders weren't the galaxy's largest freight carriers for nothing. They knew how to negotiate, better than many. A serious argument in the dialogue with the insects was 50 huge transport ships, cargo barges, filled to the brim with exotic meat delicacies and still-living rare animals and reasonably intelligent beings. The colicoids immediately felt respect, love, and appetite for this offering. And then, for the first batch of droidekas, the traders partially paid with meat. Whether the colicoids wanted it this way or it was cheaper for the traders is not specified. Most likely it was the insects' decision. Since the colicoids had a decent amount of money and little to spend it on, but tasty meat wasn't something you found lying around. They loved good barbecue. A few words about why the Trade Federation needed droidekas. Why go through the trouble of negotiating with dangerous carnivores when millions of B-1 droids from Bactoid Combat Automata, a subsidiary of Bactoid Armor Workshop, which was jointly owned by the Techno Union and the Trade Federation itself, were already in service? The thing is, the B-1 was a good droid for large-scale field battles when used en masse, but the Trade Federation increasingly faced attacks from well-equipped and heavily armed pirates. Sometimes the problem of ship defense during boarding could be solved by installing automatic or remotely controlled turrets, hidden in the walls and bulkheads. But the traders' cargo ships were so huge and had as many entry points as holes in Swiss cheese, so you couldn't just place turrets everywhere. It was better to take out the pirates on your own ship if they had already boarded, preventing them from stealing valuable and not so honestly acquired goods, rather than chasing them around later. The traders decided that, since thousands of turrets inside the ship were too expensive, why not order mobile turrets that could roll to where they were needed? Equip them with light, rapid-fire blasters and provide a shield that light firearms couldn't penetrate. And pirates wouldn't bring heavy blasters and grenade launchers on board. Even a single such turret in a relatively narrow ship corridor would be a serious obstacle. And that's exactly how it turned out. It's worth noting that initially, droidekas were not planned for use in ground battles. It was only later that the realization came that droidekas were extremely useful in urban combat. They had the capability to unleash a torrent of plasma fire in city streets while not having to worry much about return fire. By the time of the invasion of Naboo, the concept of coordinating droidekas with B-1 droids had formed. The idea, which was later implemented, was to use droideka units in places where AAT tanks couldn't go and STAPs couldn't fly, such as city streets or inside buildings. The Directorate of the Trade Federation, also known as the Executive Council, took a long time to decide on their requirements for the future combat droid. The debate wasn't about the design, which was left to the colicoids, nor about the technical specifications, where they wanted the best of everything. The main point of contention was the price. The colicoids didn't hold back and proposed a very substantial price, which was expected given their quality. I can imagine the conversations within the Trade Federation at that time. It's worth mentioning a few words about the cost of these new droids. The first episode, released back in 1999, was accompanied by several guides. This became a tradition, with each new Star Wars movie release being followed by guides and encyclopedias detailing what we saw on screen. A smart commercial move. However, the issue of the price was somehow overlooked in those early books. The first hint about the cost of droidekas appeared in the guide for the second episode, Attack of the Clones, the Visual Dictionary. It mentioned that a droideka cost 200 times more than a B-1 droid, without specifying which B-1 modification. Depending on the configuration, these droids ranged significantly in price, from 900 to 1,600 credits. There were cheaper and more expensive options. But even if we consider the cheapest B-1 model at 900 credits, it means a single droideka costs as much as a very advanced starfighter. Or, for comparison, consider the Venator-class Star Destroyer. The price of this aircraft carrier cruiser was 59 million credits. So, it turns out, ladies and gentlemen, that this colossal ship, over a kilometer of metal and plastic with numerous guns and electronics, costs the same as 327 droidekas? The final price of a droideka was revealed in the Saga Edition Core rulebook, published in 2007, 5 years after that memorable second episode guide. They took their time. The 200 times more than a B-1 detail was never mentioned again. The revised price for a droideka was 21,000 credits. However, this was the price for the upgraded droideka, which we'll get to later. The base model was cheaper, though still not inexpensive. In the new canon, nothing changed. The 21,000 credits price was carried over into Star Wars. Yes, it was very expensive, but clone infantrymen, whom the droidekas often mowed down by the dozens, were even more costly. How much exactly we can only guess based on indirect data. Colicoids, accustomed to doing things well, immediately proposed installing full-fledged artificial intelligence on combat droids. It would have been more expensive, but it would have given the droid autonomy on the level of assassin droids. However, the Nemodians feared machines with artificial intelligence. They already had an unpleasant precedent when rogue droids shot part of the Trade Federation Directorate. Moreover, Newt Gunray simply did not trust the colicoids. Therefore, the Nemodians decided to take precautions by subjugating all droids to a control station, which was installed on ships or ground bases with a range of up to 5,000 kilometers. Although later, miniature control devices in the form of a tablet with a short communication range appeared. For example, this was used by George Cardas in the novel Outbound Flight. To be fair, I'll note that Newt Gunray's fears were not unfounded. There were unfortunate incidents with droidekas equipped with artificial intelligence. Sometimes, due to unclear and fuzzy orders, they would open fire on their own. The colicoids strongly objected to such abuse of their ability to create autonomous combat droids. But the Nemodians were uncompromising. Security, self-preservation, and saving money were more important to them. The first series of droidekas were made subordinate to the central controlling computer. To be precise, the computer gave general instructions, not groups of operators, and the droid itself chose the best course of action based on the programs and directives embedded in it. The colicoids quickly produced the droidekas. Fortunately, the Beetles already had not only immense experience, but also some developments on this topic. The finished project was simply adjusted to meet the customer's requirements and issued for review. The first tests on live competitors were successful. The competitors remained dead, and the Nemodians were satisfied. Therefore, the first batch was ordered immediately, paid for with meat and credit cards. And as soon as the droids were in the hangars of the Trade Federation ships, they were immediately used against other competitors, pirates, and dissatisfied customers. By that time, there were no fewer dissatisfied people in the Trade Federation than there were grains of sand in the desert. There were plenty to choose from. The effect exceeded all expectations. The Directorate was pleased with the new droids. Until the intervention on Naboo, that is, 32 years before Yavin, the colicoids had managed to assemble several modifications of droidekas. The differences were insignificant and mostly related to the software. It was precisely from the P-series droidekas that Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon fled so joyfully in the first episode. To be precise, these were droids with serial numbers P-59 and P-60, some of the first in this new series at that time. Of course, Newt Gunray took the newest droids for his flagship. After the defeat on Naboo, as part of the general and again secret modernization of the droid army, new modifications of droidekas appeared. At the beginning of the Clone Wars, the main ones were droids of the Q and W series. But I'll tell you more about the modifications of the Droidekas a little later. I'd like to add that the colicoids, surprised and somewhat offended by the reluctance to buy Droidekas with artificial intelligence, did create a version with full AI, featuring a powerful processor, advanced behavioral matrix, and so on. They first made it for themselves, and then, considering the market potential and the Trade Federation's unwillingness to purchase Droidekas in large quantities, they started selling simpler and upgraded versions to anyone interested. Money is never superfluous after all, especially since the traders ordered only a few thousand units. Soon enough, Droidekas began to appear in the arsenals of large and wealthy mafia groups. Initially, law enforcement across different planets encountered them. Eventually, the Jedi also faced these intelligent droidekas. Even before the events of the first episode, the Judicial Department had already deemed the possession of droidekas illegal, similar to owning a personal tank. The fact that droidekas were being sold to anyone threatened the secrecy of the droid army. The Trade Federation, surprised by the business practices of their insectoid partners, became indignant. So, even before the first episode, those involved in military matters were aware of what droidekas were, knew about them, and feared them. After the Clone Wars, many were terrified by the mere metallic sound of rolling droidekas. Their appearance on the battlefield could force an opponent to retreat or surrender. Such was the reputation of these deadly rolling droids. Now let's move on to the next part of our story, the construction of the Droideka. We'll start with their most notable feature, the ability to transform into a wheel shape. In this form, they were stored when deactivated. Remember, we mentioned that the colicoids created droids in their own image. Well, the colicoids themselves could curl up into a ball and lie in wait for their prey. The color of their chitinous exoskeleton and their ability to remain motionless for days allowed them to blend into their surroundings. When prey approached, a colicoid would spring up instantly and attack. The colicoids were not long-distance runners. It was tiring, energy-consuming, and overall uninteresting. Additionally, their ability to curl up, play dead, and remain unnoticed helped them avoid attention from more dangerous predators. On their home planet, these predators were called Hwich, something like giant, saber-toothed tigers with 2 rows of razor-sharp teeth. I say were because the colicoids managed to exterminate them all during their Industrial Revolution. The colicoids couldn't roll like wheels, except for their ability to somersault back and forth. For example, they could make a sharp backward somersault and then a quick forward leap, impaling their opponent with their claws. The idea of moving by rolling or somersaulting was something the colicoids observed in the Lurmen, also known as the Mygetans. The speed of a droideka in the expanded universe sources is only mentioned in the 5th issue of the official Star Wars fact file. By the way, it's a very good magazine, revealing many interesting details about races, cultures, technology, ships, and more. According to it, the speed of a droideka in wheel mode is only 4.17 meters per second, or about 15 kilometers per hour. This is the average running speed of a trained human over a long distance, and even over a short distance, a human could outrun a droideka. In the movies, our battle droid, in the rare instances when it actually rolls, indeed does not exceed 15 kilometers per hour. However, there is also the animated series The Clone Wars, a top-tier source now considered equivalent to the films. There, the droideka clearly moves faster. Additionally, in the Battlefront game series, the droideka can reach significant speeds. Thus, it's fair to say that just like with the price, the franchise authors got it wrong. A more plausible figure can be found in a source from the new canon, Star Wars Journeys, The Phantom Menace, where the speed of a droideka is stated to be 75 kilometers per hour, or 20.8 meters per second. This is a more credible figure, resembling the truth. The walking mode speed is up to 2 kilometers per hour, or half a meter per second. This figure raises no questions, as the droideka indeed walks slowly on its legs. And why should it hurry when it can activate its shield and spray plasma everywhere? When looking at a droideka, 2 questions usually arise. How could it overcome stairs, building debris, and other similar obstacles, and what powered its movement? Let's start with the latter. In the base of the droid, there is a mini thermonuclear fusion reactor, which we'll discuss later, and a repulsor lift generator, or anti-grav. This is what powered the droid, which, by the way, weighs 75 kilograms. Not much. Typically, repulsor lift generators and projectors are installed on flying vehicles to lift them into the air. In this case, a network of micro-repulsor lifts, resembling capillaries, encased the bulge on the back and the rear leg. The repulsor lift's impulses caused the droid to rotate. To change direction while moving, the repulsor lift simply adjusted their impulse direction. The repulsor lift was also used for braking. On planets with strong gravity, the micro-repulsor lift simplified movement in walking mode, and in low-gravity environments, like when the gravity is turned off on a ship, the Droideka could levitate. A clever solution indeed. But then, that's what colicoids are known for, finding unconventional solutions for their creations. Some experts even managed to attach a more powerful repulsor lift to the Droideka, making it capable of flying. What a sight that must have been. In its rolled-up form, the rear support leg formed part of the wheel. This rear leg was also used for jumping. This is particularly noticeable in the game Battlefront 2. Moreover, the rear leg played a crucial role in transforming into walker mode. During this time, the front legs and arms folded in the center, shielding the machine's head while moving. The deflector projector plates also folded inward. All of this allowed the Droideka to overcome stairs and moderately complex ruins, move across rough terrain, and even run in the mountains. Not quickly, not very confidently, but still. Droidekas couldn't climb walls, though. At least in this aspect, the enemies of the Trade Federation and the Confederacy were fortunate. Another remarkable distinctive feature of the Droideka, which makes it so impressive, is its energy shield, the deflector. These shield projectors are these two perforated blades. The shield is the most technically complex and most expensive part of the droid. Well, after the reactor, of course, it's quite a challenge to fit a powerful shield into such a small machine, and the Droideka's shield is indeed serious. It's comparable to the shields of many fighters, such as the T-65 X-Wing. Incidentally, the droid's mini-reactor was also of fighter class. But let's focus on the shield for now. On the Droideka, a deflector that protects only against energy weapons was combined with a particle shield. Only objects moving at a speed of 1 to 2 meters per second, that is 3.5 to 7 kilometers per hour, could penetrate the shield, completely eliminating the threat from bullet weapons and shrapnel. That's why, in one episode of the animated series, ion grenades were rolled. If rolled too quickly, the grenade would bounce off the shield. It's precisely because of these shields that clones hated Droidekas so much. To take down the shield, you had to shoot at the Droideka for a long time, aiming to overload and collapse the shield, all while somehow avoiding return fire. You couldn't hope to disable the Droideka with an ion grenade. The shield also protected against ion pulses. You throw such a grenade, peek out from cover and see all the other droids lying down and sparking, while one angry Droideka looks at your smug face and you hear the annoying buzz of blasters being armed. A lightsaber also couldn't penetrate the shield, which made the Droidekas additionally hated by the Jedi. The Droideka isn't selfish. It can shield nearby infantry with its shield. You can sit under the shield, poke out a blaster barrel, and fire at the enemy, adding more firepower to your improvised firing point, and more trouble for the enemy. Or another way, the infantry can follow right behind the Droideka, using its shield for cover. Not very convenient, but better than nothing. After the Clone Wars, the Droidekas were adopted by the Galactic Empire, but we'll get to that point later. Have Jedi patience. The shield, of course, is a good thing, but it is terribly power-hungry. Therefore, it activates only when an armed enemy appears. More precisely, when it manages to spot its opponent. But what about a sudden attack or during movement? Or what to do when the droid encounters a person whose status is unknown? Is he an enemy or an ally? After all, bipeds, especially Homo sapiens, are exceptionally cunning when it comes to survival. Hiding a blaster or a grenade in a pocket, and at the right moment pulling it out, could turn an expensive combat toy into scrap metal. So the colicoids, after thinking it over, decided to equip their creation with some armor. The parts of the body painted in brown are made of a metal called bronzium. Some of the early parts are also made of bronzium. Despite the similarity in name, this metal has nothing to do with bronze, well, except for the color. This is a very durable, quite expensive, and very heavy metal. Due to its mass, bronzium was rarely used for individual protective gear, such as armor. Instead, it was used for casting and reinforcing droid bodies, structural components of buildings, bulkheads of ships, and similar applications. But rare doesn't mean never. For example, the highly respected bug knights of Cato Nemoidia had their armor forged from bronzium, well, respected only on their planet. Later, the armor of the Nemoidian Guard was also made of bronzium. In the films, you might have noticed the statues in the Jedi temple on Coruscant and the statuettes of the sages of Dwartii in Supreme Chancellor Palpatine's office. All of these were cast from bronzium. Bronzium is highly resistant to blaster fire. If you look at the Droideka from the back, a large part of it is covered by a massive bronzium hump. The joints of the arms and cannons are also made of bronzium. Most importantly, the dome of the thermonuclear mini-reactor is made of thick, hardened bronzium, just in case. But a decent shield and armor set up just in case aren't a panacea for all troubles, and the Droideka was not immortal. Well, if you can consider a droid a living being at all. Besides rolling grenades, there were other ways to kill a Droideka. The simplest and most obvious was heavy weaponry, such as E-web blasters, anti-tank rocket launchers, and the like. Of course, there were also tank guns, artillery, and bombers. But the Droideka was not meant for field battles. Although during the Clone Wars, Droidekas were sometimes foolishly sent into combined arms battles where they were least useful. There they were easily destroyed by artillery, tanks, or airstrikes. A completely different scenario unfolded during firefights in buildings or tight spaces. Essentially, places where heavy blasters and rocket launchers couldn't be effectively used, either because there wasn't enough room to maneuver, you couldn't carry them in, or you might harm yourself. And heavy weapons aren't always at hand. Therefore, when encountering a Droideka, enemies would start shooting at it from all weapons like madmen, hoping to take down the shield. Or if the rifle was serious enough, like a DC-15A, you could crank up the power to maximum and hope to defeat the Droideka with the residual energy of the shot without taking down the shield. This tactic was sometimes used in ship battles, where a powerful concentrated salvo would disable specific components and sections of a ship. The shield might still be up, but the bridge would be burning. You could try something similar on a smaller scale with a Droideka. However, you had to shoot very accurately. There were a few other ways to neutralize the Droideka. In the animated series The Clone Wars, during the Second Battle of Geonosis, a method previously mentioned in books was shown. You could stick your hand under the shield and shoot the tin can in the head. Though it was advisable to have some protection for your hand, as the shield emits strong radiation that could cause radiation sickness. And sneaking up on a Droideka was a task in itself, especially if it wasn't alone. You could either become a hero or a posthumous hero. Although just the thought of sticking a hand under a Droideka's shield is worthy of a Darwin Award. In the novel Outbound Flight, which I highly recommend, there is a moment where Thrawn, the blue-skinned art historian, asks George Cardass if his soldiers can be given Droideka shields, to which George objects, saying, "Sorry, but the shields are highly radioactive." The Droideka shield had one weak spot. It was located at the top, where the shield was projected. And it was weakest there. If you somehow manage to be above the Droideka, you should shoot it from above. There's a massive piece of bronzium there, but the shield in that sector is the weakest. Clones who were lucky enough to take higher positions, and particularly agile and brave Jedi, sometimes used this to their advantage. Another way to destroy a Droideka was to trap it near a wall or other solid object where it couldn't activate its shield without being thrown to the side. A Droideka lying on its side also couldn't use its shield. It's best to prevent the Droideka from activating its shield in the first place by ambushing it or attacking it before it could assume its combat stance while still in wheel mode. Armor is armor, but this made destroying the Droideka much easier. As we mentioned earlier, the shield was not always active due to its high energy consumption. The fighter-level shield, repulsor lifts, and cannons all drew power from a miniature thermonuclear reactor housed in the dome at the base of the droid. When the colicoids created the Droideka, they intended it to be a combat machine with a high level of autonomy, and couldn't imagine the extent of the caution and greed of the Neimoidians, who didn't want to install artificial intelligence on the droid, severely limiting its autonomy. But after Naboo, when the Neimoidians realized that the droids needed some level of independence to prevent them from being disabled by destroying the control station or intercepting control signals, they started installing primitive artificial intelligence on Droidekas. That's when the machine truly came into its own. The mini-reactor provided a greater range and autonomy, much greater than the energy batteries that powered almost all other Trade Federation and later Confederacy of Independent Systems droids. For example, a couple of Droidekas could be sent on long-range reconnaissance. Their sensors were decent, and they could travel a couple of 1,000 kilometers on one fuel charge, something B-1 battle droids couldn't do. Even the batteries of BX series commando droids would drain faster when attempting to find something or someone far from base over a week or two. But Droidekas with upgraded AI could be used for reconnaissance. However, for obvious reasons, only as exceptions. It's still better to use something more suitable for reconnaissance, like commando droids. It was precisely because of the reactor and the shield that the Droideka's price was so high. They couldn't limit themselves to energy cells due to the shield's voracious energy demands. Although Droidekas also had energy cells, they were installed in the machine's spine. They were recharged by the reactor and were necessary in case of a major malfunction, like the reactor breaking down. This way, the machine could at least hobble, or rather roll, back to its base. Or it could engage in limited combat without the shield. Either the battery would run out, or the Droideka would be destroyed first. Droidekas without shields don't last long. Another drawback of the Droideka, aside from its obscenely high price, was the reactor's explosiveness. The Droideka rarely exploded, but when it did, it was quite effective. If the reactor was severely damaged, and if the safeguards failed, and if many other factors aligned, it would be very unpleasant for everyone nearby. If your unlucky self happened to be close by, well, rest in peace. I couldn't find any information on whether the wartime Droidekas had a self-destruct system. Most likely, they didn't. Although the Separatists sometimes installed explosive self-destruct systems on some of their droids, the third energy consumer in the Droideka were its guns. Each arm was equipped with 2 twin blasters, which would fire by momentarily extending the barrels beyond the shield's edge. The blaster's power wasn't impressive. It was comparable to that of light blaster carbines, pistols, and other light firearms. The accuracy also left much to be desired. After all, the Droideka wasn't designed for sniping. It didn't need powerful guns. Thanks to its high rate of fire, the machine could create a torrent of plasma fire, forcing enemies to take cover. Those who managed to dive for cover survived, while those who didn't became vulture prey. The early Droidekas lacked standard photoreceptors and instead had some sort of radiation sensors, but the Droidekas in the first episode, particularly the P-series, were equipped with a full set of sensors and scanners. The Droideka could see perfectly even in poor lighting conditions, such as a dark ship corridor or a moonless, quiet night. It was also equipped with a thermal imager, could hear well, sense vibrations, and most importantly, its onboard processor could process all this information efficiently and provide target indications. It turned out to be a very attentive piece of machinery. Fortunately, it had no nose, meaning no olfactory sensors. If the Droideka could smell you as well, you'd be in serious trouble. By the way, there are dog droids in Star Wars. Even the Droideka's relatively weak blasters were more than enough to penetrate the armor of clones and stormtroopers at close range. Maybe not on the first shot and not with every shot, but the rate of fire made a big difference. Now, let's discuss the Droideka's drawbacks. There were quite a few, in addition to those already mentioned. The top one, in our opinion, was its mobility. On rough terrain or among building ruins, the Droideka was sluggish. Even if it could get through, it would move very slowly. The droid's electronic brains couldn't always find a safe path through the chaos left by a battle. It also struggled in dense forests and thick undergrowth. The Droideka couldn't cross water obstacles. It had trouble moving on foot through shallow water. And in wheel mode, it was even worse. The worst terrain for the Droideka was soft, boggy ground. For example, roads washed out by rain or melting snow. Forested swamp areas were also a nightmare for the Droideka. And on sand, the Droideka moved very poorly, almost not at all. Neither in wheel mode nor walker mode. The desert was clearly not its domain. Coastal wet sand was also problematic for the Droideka's feet. All this somewhat simplified the task of countering these combat balls. For example, if your battalion is stationed in a forest, you already know all the tank dangerous and Droideka dangerous directions. You've set up blockades on roads and paths, and you can direct the enemy's movement in a way that benefits you. The same goes for cities, and it's even easier in the mountains. You always know where the Droidekas will appear and can place a couple of reliable guys with rocket launchers there. Unlike spider droids, Droidekas can't climb steep cliffs. Another disadvantage of the machine is its cost and the complexity of maintenance. Most other battle droids don't have many complicated elements beyond the electronic brains with combat programs. But Droidekas, in addition to all that, have a nuclear reactor, a deflector shield generator and projector, and repulsor lifts. All this needs to be maintained, fueled, and repaired if necessary. A Droideka that returns from battle also needs to be cleaned and cleared of dirt. Repulsor lifts covered in clumps of mud don't work as effectively, if at all. This also applies to shield projectors. And the shield itself is a complicated piece of equipment. The wealthy Trade Federation, and later the Confederacy of Independent Systems, had no problems at all with maintaining Droidekas. But other operators of these droids could have a hard time without good equipment and skilled mechanics of various specializations. Unlike bipedal droids, Droidekas are always in plain sight, with their weapons and sensors positioned in such a way that shooting from cover is out of the question. This means that as soon as a Droideka appears in the enemy's line of sight, it gets hit with everything the enemy can throw at it. The Droideka couldn't even crouch to reduce its profile. For example, it couldn't sit behind a crate, recharge its shield, pop out to shoot, and then sit back down. Another issue was the guns. Yes, they are rapid fire. Yes, they are good. And yes, they can penetrate clone armor at close range, but have you seen manipulators, that is, hands on a Droideka? No. So how and with what does it reload the blasters? It can't. In battle, the Droideka has a very short tactical cycle. It rolls out, fires, and rolls back to the nearest strong point for reloading. Thanks to the reactor, the blasters could be powered for years, but the blaster gas still needed to be refilled by someone. Also, the Droideka couldn't shoot at point-blank range because its blasters were spread too far apart. If an enemy appeared to the side or behind, the Droideka had to turn its whole body. Vertical aiming angles were even worse. Unlike a human, a Droideka couldn't shoot straight up or down, severely limiting its tactical flexibility. I like the droid army precisely for its tactical flexibility and multi-purpose capabilities. With skillful leadership, these electronic dunces can become a true nightmare for any enemy. Despite the interests of the separatists' bourgeois camp and the disappointment of the democratic principles supporters from the Republican camp, the advantages of Droidekas outweighed their drawbacks. This is why several modifications of the Droideka were produced before the Clone Wars, with several series, models, and modifications being released. So, let's talk about the modifications of the Droideka. We'll start with the two most widely used military series, namely the W series and the Q series. They looked identical on the outside, differing only in their internals. The W series, which you saw on Geonosis, had more powerful blasters compared to the P series. Due to this, the directive was embedded in the Droideka's programming to activate the shield only when under fire. You can understand that sometimes a single lucky shot was enough to destroy the droid. One shot from a DC-15A rifle at maximum power could send an expensive Droideka to the scrapyard. The merchants were unhappy. Later, the Confederacy of Independent Systems reconsidered and adjusted the programming to allow the droid to activate its shields immediately upon deployment if anyone with a rifle was in sight. During the Battle of Geonosis, 3,000 droidekas were involved, quite a significant number considering their cost. For comparison, on this desert planet, a little over 1 million B-1 series droids, 100,000 B-2 droids, and 15,000 DSD-1 Spider droids fought against the clones for several days. The rest of the equipment also numbered in the thousands, and the clones managed to break it all, being even more destructive than children in a sandbox. The Q-series droidekas had improved targeting systems and shield operations, and their production was ramped up in the first year of the war. You can see the Q-series droidekas in the Clone Wars animated series during episodes depicting the second half of the war, and in the third movie episode aboard the Invisible Hand. It seems that shortly before the Clone Wars, the shields of the W and Q series droidekas stopped emitting radiation to the extent that a Geiger counter would go off. So, you could safely stick your hand under the shield and try to twist off the droid's head. And since there was a high probability that droidekas would be used not only on ships in the upcoming war, considerations were made for their rapid deployment. Special landing shuttles were developed to quickly deploy up to 6 droidekas in wheel transformation. However, it appears that such transporters were very few, as they are only mentioned briefly a couple of times. Droidekas could also be deployed using drop pods. These pods were cheaper than those occasionally used by clones and later more frequently by stormtroopers, as droidekas didn't need life support systems, gravitational and inertial compensators, or advanced braking engines. Notably, both modifications were produced not only by the colicoids on their home planet of Cola 4, but also in dozens of other factories under the umbrella of the company Flak Arfok Automata Industries. Both W and Q droideka modifications not only rolled across battlefields and formed anti-boarding forces on major separatist warships, but they also protected their bases. Confederacy generals and admirals often brought droidekas with them, and high-ranking officials and military leaders of the Confederacy did not shy away from using droidekas as bodyguards. For example, droidekas guarded San Hill, the leader of the banking clan. Naturally, the higher the official, the better the droid, with more advanced programming and more sophisticated artificial intelligence. San Hill's droidekas had the top configuration. Though if I were in his place, I would still choose the IG-100 Magna Guard droids. Additionally, the Galactic Republic purchased top-configured droidekas from the colicoids. Yes, you heard it right. The Republic purchased several dozen droidekas in the highest configuration with the most powerful artificial intelligence for the outbound flight research vessel project. The droidekas purchased by the Republic were highly advanced, capable of adapting to enemy actions on the fly. They could maneuver their blasters in all directions, had more powerful shields, though how much more powerful could they get, and could even fire while moving in wheel mode. Here's a quote from the novel Survivor Quest. "Mara, did you know a droideka can shoot while moving?" "No," Mara replied. "Either it was kept a big secret, or someone added this feature to this specific model. By the way, it's not very effective. Did you notice it can only shoot along its axis of movement and only when its blasters are aimed at the target point?" One droideka almost killed Luke Skywalker and Mara Jade. If not for Jedi ingenuity, who knows what would have happened to the galaxy? Yes, the fate of the galaxy could have been influenced by a combat droideka that was already 50 years old and not in the best technical condition. Fortunately, most of the droidekas on the outbound flight were of the P series, which the Republic had confiscated from the Trade Federation as part of a legal process. Newt Gunray, Lot DOD, and a few others from the Trade Federation Directorate were accused of war and economic crimes, abuse of power, conspiracy to commit murder, and other charges after the Naboo conflict. But a bribe here, a bribe there, and they were free again, continuing their shady dealings. However, they refused to return the confiscated items, citing reparations and compensation. And so, the droidekas ended up on the outbound flight. There were several hundred of them, along with B-1 battle droids and droid starfighter, which Thrawn used successfully against the perpetual enemies of the Vagari. By the way, we recommend reading Outbound Flight and marveling at Thrawn's ingenuity. At that time, besides the Republic and megacorporations like the Trade Federation, Techno-Union, and Banking Clan, only some criminal organizations had droidekas in their arsenal. In the new canon, for example, the Ex-Rexus cartel had a few droidekas, but the old canon had a similar story. If the Mafia has money, good connections, and dangerous enemies, they might have droidekas. A particularly unusual modification was the grapple droideka, sometimes called the melee destroyer droid. Remember how we mentioned the lack of manipulator arms on a droideka? Well, someone addressed this problem radically by taking away the blasters and replacing them with full-fledged clawed arms. Since this droid was meant to fight in close combat, it had stronger armor but weaker shields. In all other respects, it was a standard droideka, identical to the P series. These melee droidekas were produced in very small quantities by the Trade Federation and were almost never used in battles. It's understandable why. They were soon forgotten, like a bad dream. In the new canon, you can find one such droideka, quite resourceful by the way, named the Unwinder. It fought in a gladiatorial arena. The Unwinder didn't have blaster cannons, instead it had full manipulators that it used to maim and tear apart opponents in the arena. However, it's unclear whether the Unwinder was originally this modification or if someone converted it into a grappled droideka. The result was mixed, but approaching it was still dangerous. One of the previously mentioned drawbacks of the droideka is its short, effective firing range. Soon, the clones had the misfortune of encountering a new version of the droideka, aptly named the sniper droideka due to its usage. There were two variants of these sniper droids. The first variant was a modification of the standard droideka. The second variant was noticeably different from the standard droideka. It was slightly larger, with a body height of 187 centimeters compared to the standard version's 183 centimeters. The rapid-fire blasters were replaced with a long-barreled blaster based on one of the Confederacy's sniper rifles. This variant also featured more sensitive sensors and an improved targeting system, making it a true sniper, a rarity in the Star Wars universe. Typically, Star Wars droids are notoriously inaccurate at long ranges, except for high-end, extraordinarily expensive assassin droids produced in very small quantities or even unique named models. However, this sniper droideka was a highly accurate serial product, capable of hitting targets with great precision, even picking off enemies among Allied troops. Additionally, the long-barreled blaster boasted considerable power, able to pierce through clones. However, as we know, there's always a price to pay. When the Confederacy leaders saw the price tag from the manufacturers, they were somewhat shocked. They had to simplify the design and components. Firstly, they ditched the very expensive deflector shield, replacing it with a retractable bronzium shield reinforced with quadranium. As long as the droideka faced the enemy, it was fine. It was vulnerable only from the sides. Without an energy shield, a simpler, cheaper reactor could be used. Yet, even with these adjustments, the sniper droideka cost 30,565 credits, 9,000 credits more than a standard droideka. However, it was worth it. It functioned as either a mobile, high-precision turret, or a mobile sniper platform. It could fire a couple of shots, transform into wheel mode, and move to a new position. Sniper droidekas proved most effective in urban and mountainous terrain, where there were plenty of cover opportunities. In the mountains, sniper droidekas would take higher positions and terrorize the clones from there. Naturally, the clones were not pleased with this. Despite their cost, the value of the sniper droideka was high, leading to their production in small batches, primarily used in the last year and a half of the war. Another model, the Ultra Droideka, stood over 3 meters tall and resembled a walking mini-tank. The Ultra Droideka was intended to provide fire support for infantry, acting as an equivalent to the largest versions of crab droids or a light tank. It was also expected to be used in special missions alongside IG-110 droids armed with lightsabers, providing fire support. While the IG-110 droids engaged Jedi in close combat, the Ultra Droideka would wait for an opportunity to strike. For example, it could fire at the Jedi and its own droids during the fight, taking advantage of the IG-110 droids locking the Jedi in combat. The loss of a couple of droids, even expensive ones like the IG-110 droids, was considered a small price for killing a Jedi. However, this idea didn't work out well, and unsurprisingly failed miserably. The simplifications in this model were significant. Firstly, the shield was much weaker and was activated only in critical situations for a short duration. Secondly, instead of the strong but expensive bronzium, durasteel was used. The targeting system remained as good as that of the standard Droideka. Instead of light blasters, it was equipped with blaster cannons with firepower equivalent to heavy repeater blasters, similar to a large-caliber machine gun. Oh, and I almost forgot. For some reason, they also taught the Ultra Droideka to speak basic. Who needs a chatty, oversized Droideka with mediocre shields and armor, though still quite durable, costing 29,000 credits? 8,000 more than a standard Droideka. Who needs it? Do you? No? The Separatists weren't very interested either. Naturally, the Confederacy didn't limit itself to just 2 models. The ingenious minds at Bactoid Combat Automata, a subsidiary of Bactoid Armor Workshop, owned by the Techno Union and the Trade Federation, decided to take matters into their own hands and drastically improve the design, creating a new combat machine based on the Droideka. They took on additional responsibilities and ended up failing spectacularly. Design work, testing, and production were conducted on the planet Hypori. Hypori is a rather dull planet in the Ferra sector of the Outer Rim. The work began before the war and concluded right at the end of the Clone Wars. What they ultimately presented to the public was simply and aptly named the Droideka Mark II, or the second-generation Droideka. It was adopted by the Confederacy and a few thousand units were built, but it didn't play a significant role. The machine remained in the realm of experimental limited production models. The factory on Hypori was soon abandoned and forgotten, but it was not destined to be relegated to history. Many years later, the second model was revived by Taiba Zan. His rapidly rising criminal empire, the Zan Consortium, scoured the galaxy for new droids and weaponry. When the consortium was gaining power, the crime lord Jabba the Hutt discovered that the Mark II Droidekas and the abandoned factory were on Hypori. Naturally, he intended to seize the valuable machines and the factory producing them. To avoid unnecessary risks, Jabba managed to lure the consortium to Hypori, hoping that Zan would clear the way to the factory. Afterward, Jabba planned to kill Zan and his men by deploying his own thugs behind Zan's mercenaries. But Jabba's plan failed, a rare occurrence. Zan's bandits managed to eliminate Jabba's goons. After temporarily neutralizing the threat posed by Jabba, the consortium managed to restart the factories, and soon new droidekas began appearing in the hands of mercenary groups and private armies across the galaxy. However, they were very rare due to their high cost. Despite their small numbers, everyone understood that the metallic nightmare of the Clone Wars had returned. The new Droideka, unlike its predecessor, had a vocabulator and could communicate in Galactic Basic, like the Ultra Droideka. Additionally, the machine had an integrated comlink, which simplified battlefield coordination. It was protected by light anti-blaster armor made of bronzium reinforced with quadranium inserts that shielded some of the machine's components. However, the primary means of protection for the second model remained its deflector shield, which only activated in walker mode. The Droideka retained the ability to move in wheel mode, traveling at the same speed as its predecessor. However, in this position, the Mark II was still vulnerable. The main difference from the previous model of the Droideka was the increased variety and number of weapons. While the earlier model Droidekas were a threat only to infantry, the second model was dangerous even to light vehicles, which it could disable with its rapid-fire light ion cannons. Such weaponry on small combat droids was a rarity. However, the Droideka remained vulnerable to grenade launchers and laser cannons. Heavy blaster cannons from tanks and armored vehicles, as well as heavy repeating blasters, also posed a significant threat to the second model. Ever since the consortium started trading these droids, nearly everyone seeking to acquire Droidekas wanted to get their hands on the second model. Potential customers could be understood, as the consortium significantly improved the design of the old Droideka, on top of the enhancements already made by its developers. The result was something that became deadly dangerous to any living being. A separate topic is the droid's modification. To make desired improvements, one could use aftermarket upgrade kits produced by consortium factories. However, the droid's design was so successful, modular, and convenient that a handy enthusiast of mobile metal might not need them. Honestly, to modify the droid, all you needed was to find a tech-savvy Jawa. Although finding an unskilled one might be harder, get the necessary tools, and give the aforementioned Jawa a handful of credits. In less than an hour, the client would have their droid with the desired capabilities, and the Jawa would vanish at light speed with the earned credits, and if lucky, a couple of extra parts under its arm. They love to steal everything not bolted down, you know. Repairing the droid also posed no major issues. Owners of Droidekas didn't have to go directly to the consortium for needed parts. Many parts and mechanisms of the basic Droideka and the second model were interchangeable, allowing owners to successfully rely on the remnants of war. The Separatists had produced so much of this war surplus that fans of heavily armed droids had enough to last for many decades. The interchangeability of parts was also useful to various small dealers trading in the used parts market. Speaking of Jawas, these short beings often used droidekas obtained from who knows where for the armed protection of their massive desert crawlers, which served as both mobile homes and trading shops. It's not hard to guess that on the Tatooine, these impressive walking turrets could convince a lightly armed miser not to cause trouble and to offer a fair price for the goods. After all, otherwise the miser might start waving a blaster around, disturbing the so-called honest merchants. Everyone knows that on Tatooine, trading with a blaster in hand tends to be more honest. The Jawas not only scavenged and assembled droidekas of all modifications for themselves, but also for sale. But it wasn't just the Jawas trading in droidekas. Other black market dealers could be found selling and reselling the second model droidekas, though some managed to purchase a droideka through legal means. The versatility of the droideka's chassis of the second generation allowed for the creation interesting modifications based on it. Obviously, many owners of the second model made additional improvements to their droidekas, capable of fatally surprising any opponent. During the Galactic Civil War, variants of the Oppressor Droideka and Sentinel Droideka were used in combat. The Sentinel differed from the basic Droideka only in increased firepower. The blasters became more powerful, but the Oppressor became a more serious modification. Crazy contraband hands fitted contraband guns to it, specifically cannons, turning the droid into a kind of analog of a light, self-propelled artillery installation. The Semi-Bush League handicraft even pleased the Imperials. The Galactic Empire limitedly used a small number of Sentinels and Oppressors, and the Rebel Alliance too did not remain on the sidelines acquiring some of these droidekas. By the way, in the original Star Wars, that is, in the expanded universe, the Rebels also occasionally used droidekas, but these were isolated cases. They didn't adopt them into their arsenal, and they were wrong not to. A good droid, after all. But the Galactic Empire's military command gladly adopted a former separatist droid. What the clones themselves thought about this, history does not disclose. It seems that not long ago they were running away from these serfs, sweating nervously, trying to destroy them. Now, they're fighting for us. It is unknown what words they were greeted with in the ranks, if they were greeted at all. Or were they greeted just like another military trophy, another piece of equipment added to the Empire's arsenal, the DSD-1 spider droids. Let's quote Stormtrooper TK-342. You fought against them. You know their weaknesses, and, what's even more important, you know how deadly they can be as killers. Meet the new addition to the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps. Perhaps you've already wondered why the Empire needed droids and other equipment from the defeated Separatists. And then, friends and comrades, right after the Clone Wars, the Galactic Empire began rapidly increasing the size of its army and fleet. There were enough people for the army, but not for the elite stormtrooper corps. Initially, only clones served there, not humans. And clones, even though they matured quickly, still needed to be grown. Palpatine, casting his gaze over a pile of trophy military scrap metal, looked at the intact separatist military factories that had fallen into his lap, and grandly ordered it all to be put into circulation. The first 5-year shortage of live cannon fodder was successfully compensated for by the best droids from the Confederacy's arsenal. The droidekas were used by the Empire in battles against the Confederate remnant, whichever you prefer. And in these battles, the droidekas with Imperial insignias often faced off against droidekas with the still intact symbols of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. It was an interesting sight to see droidekas on both sides of the barricades. Moreover, the Galactic Empire even placed orders for the production of new droidekas to recently nationalized separatist factories. But even without the production of new combat spheres, the military trophies were obtained in such quantities that the Galactic Empire began trading surplus with loyal planets and states that retained a significant degree of autonomy within the Empire. Among the latter was the corporate sector. They gobbled up these leftovers from the Imperial table. Since they were able to buy 520 barely used Victory-class Star Destroyers from the Empire, what would stop them from buying tens of thousands of droidekas? Yes, you heard that right. The corporate sector bought 520 Star Destroyers, 520 battleships. Now that's what we call a purchase of galactic proportions. The purchased droidekas were used by the corporate sector's army to guard factories, mines, ships from attacks by wild beasts and even wilder pirates and all sorts of aggressive natives who tried to prevent the uninvited guests from exploiting their natural resources. In the first 3 years after the Clone Wars, numerous remnants of the Confederacy owned the second largest fleet of droidekas. For example, the forces of warlord Gizor Delso, including droidekas, fought against the Galactic Empire up to the 12th year before the Battle of Yavin. His forces were constantly on the move, attacking in different places and causing damage. For 7 years, Gizor successfully resisted the Empire. The Geonosians, like the colicoids, belonged to the insectoid races. It is important to note that the Empire did not forget about the colicoids, masters of weapon-making. While the Imperial Army and Navy pursued the remnants of the separatists, destroyed pirates, slave traders, the first rebel movements, and anyone who happened to be in their way, the Empire also paid attention to the colicoids. Imperial forces firmly stated, "We're here to stay for a while, and that's not up for discussion." They backed up their words by demonstrating their power, pointing to the Star Destroyer hovering in orbit. "If you're against it, we'll roast you right here so crispy you won't even ask for seasoning. And if you're for our presence, here's meat, here's money, here's equipment with technologies, let's be friends." But you already know which option the colicoids chose. They were able to negotiate with them, as long as they had power on their side. As Al Capone said, "You can get much further with a kind word and a gun than with just a kind word." The Imperials established themselves firmly and for a long time through the system of the Cola. They effectively nationalized the colicoids' factories and plants and set up their own. A planetary shield appeared on the planet, along with numerous military bases, anti-space defense systems, and so on. Cola 4 became a so-called fortress world. This continued until the 5th year after Yavin, that is, until the end of the 1st year after the Imperial disaster over Endor. The colicoids had to endure the Imperials' caring but perfectly stuffy, or rather just stuffy, military and civilian personnel for a long time. During the strategic offensive operation on the worlds of the Inner Rim, the Third Fleet of the New Republic, under the command of Admiral Akbar, entered into a protracted bloody battle with the fleet and local garrison commanded by Imperial Admiral Ledra Okens. Of course, they fought not only in the Cola system, but also in several neighboring sectors. The New Republic's task was seize the key fortress world in the region and clear the parliamentary path to Brental 4. There was a very interesting military campaign there. Major battles, ambushes, raids, deceptive maneuvers, and prolonged planetary sieges with bloody, large-scale ground battles. Post-Endor battles were also a very interesting topic. And someday I'll tell you about that too. I'll just say how it all ended. The New Republic's fleet and army suffered huge losses, but still achieved a decisive victory, becoming one of the most important during the entire strategic offensive operation on the core and inner rim worlds. Admiral Okins died in battle, and the colicoids were liberated, although they didn't feel any particular joy about it. After all, they couldn't just eat anyone now. No more exotic meat imports. Although, considering the appetites of the colicoids, after the defeat of the Imperial forces, the remaining personnel could have been eaten even without marinade. We doubt that the New Republicans would have been against it. War writes off everything. We didn't find any information on whether the New Republic ordered any military products from the colicoids. There were probably attempts, but unsuccessful ones. Let's return to the post-war droidekas. As with many other pieces of technology and weaponry from the Clone Wars era, immediately after the war, the special services of the newly formed Empire, despite their willingness and Imperial command, failed to collect all the droidekas from separatist warehouses and confiscate them from the skilled population. Who would willingly part with such beauty? Even though it was a relatively small machine in the Confederacy's droid army, relative to the B-1 and B-2 models, of course. And in a galaxy far, far away, and in our not-so-far world, the rule applies: what lies badly usually disappears quickly. And the aforementioned Jawas were far from the only fortunate owners of droidekas. Cool and well-equipped mercenary squads also had droidekas. As an example, we can mention a private military company with the peculiar name, the Night Strike Soldier Hegemony. Their headquarters and training camps were located on the beautiful, picturesque planet of Talos. This is in the core worlds, in the Corellian sector. When fulfilling orders, Night Strike Soldier Hegemony relied on well-trained mercenaries fighting in close cooperation with combat droids, including droidekas. They had both standard and modified droidekas, although it seems they didn't have second-generation droidekas. Not all of their droids were in good condition. Sometimes they came across ones with malfunctioning deflector shields, programming problems, and so on. Of course, there were droidekas in large criminal syndicates and major pirate bands. That's where you could have met some droidekas with a high degree of probability. Usually very few, but still. Among such fortunate owners of droidekas, including second-generation droidekas, was, for example, the Hutt cartel. Visiting the palaces of the fat-bodied criminal authorities, you could often see dozens of droidekas guarding a couple of indeterminate-age Hutts, lying majestically on luxurious beds, smoking cigars and making decisions. And in the new canon, droidekas were used by the Crimora Syndicate. Here's an example of post-war use of droidekas by private but not very honest citizens. On the planet Keraba 6, located in the Hevrol sector in the mid-rim quadrant P15, there is a city with a huge amusement park. It's called Auchelis. It was guarded by 312 standard B-1 battle droids, organized into 6 squads of 52 each. They were commanded by 6 heavily modified droidekas, acting as droid officers. The head of security there was a mercenary nerd. He smuggled all kinds of contraband and sometimes helped the Empire conduct social experiments using various intoxicating substances. Of course, combat droids for such clientele were not exactly legal and often downright illegal. And when law enforcement agencies showed up to inspect the setup, they tried to hide the droids somewhere. In the expanded universe, droidekas were also used in the mines of Kessel. Yes, those same Kessel mines where convicts mined spice, in particular a variety known as Glitterstein, under the strict supervision of both living and mechanical overseers. I'll remind you that in the original Star Wars, Kessel was controlled by the Empire, not by some criminal syndicate as in the new canon. The Empire from the old canon would never allow criminals to control such an important facility producing strategically valuable raw materials, spice, which was not only a narcotic, but also a medicinal ingredient used in the production of many medications. The former Empire would politely ask the Pike Syndicate to leave, accompanying the request with a kick in the rear for persuasiveness. Droidekas guarded the Kessel mines, preventing prisoner escapes, equipment theft, and maintaining order in the Imperial prison. These droids also monitored the external perimeter, preventing attempts to free the prisoners. However, considering the frequent visits of rebels to Kessel in an attempt to free their comrades in arms, once even Wedge Antilles was freed from there, Droidekas didn't always cope with their tasks. In addition to Kessel, Imperial Droidekas were used to guard various important facilities, factories, research complexes, and mines. Both in the old and in the new canons, as I've previously noted, the history and construction of Droidekas remain unchanged. In general, for example, in the so-called new canon, Droidekas could be found guarding mines on the planet Lok. This planet is located in the Carthax sector in the Outer Rim. It hangs in the capital system of the sector with the same name, Carthax. By the way, about Imperial Droidekas, in the Stormtrooper Corps, battle spheres didn't serve for long. Exactly how long, alas, there's no data. Probably no more than 3 to 5 years. Because then the Stormtrooper Corps expanded and there were no problems with new equipment. And the most dangerous enemies of the new state, the new regime, were defeated, beaten, scattered, and driven underground. There's mention that later Droidekas ended up in training centers and in Imperial military academies, where they were used to train future stormtroopers. Naturally, these Droidekas had their blaster weapons replaced with non-lethal ones. Otherwise, hardly any cadet would survive until graduation. Most of the training Droidekas were on the planet Karida, the main and most prestigious Imperial military academy for ground forces. Karida was a military academy with a stunning reputation. It was founded 5,000 years before the events of the films. The exact date is unknown. As you understand, given the age of the academy, there were strong military traditions there. Karida, which had long been producing mighty warriors for the galaxy. Oh yes, how could one overlook the droid uprisings? No, the Droidekas themselves usually didn't revolt, but resourceful citizens skillfully used them, including other droids with well-developed artificial intelligence. For example, the well-known IG-88. In their small army of droids, there were many leftovers, so to speak, inherited from the Separatists. These were mainly models B1, B2 droids, and of course Droidekas, and 4 of their Droidekas underwent serious modifications. Almost everything was improved, from weapons and shields to artificial intelligence. The quartet of intellectual Droidekas was something like the elite guard of one of the IG-88. He simply named them Alpha, Beta, Delta, Gamma. And indeed, what other names could one expect from an assassin droid? There's a first-generation Droideka in the new canon named Dek Neil, reprogrammed personally by Dr. Cheli Lona Afra. But he differed so much from a regular Droideka that he can be considered an entirely different droid model, a different living being. After the war, many Droidekas ended up on the black market, where their price could vary greatly, depending on the droid's technical condition and equipment. So it could be 5,000 credits for a heavily used and battered Droideka, or it could be as much as 50,000. It was mainly governments of small planetary states, including those within the Empire, that purchased Droidekas on the black market, as they were not available for free sale. The few droids that were still being built shortly after the end of the war were purchased not only by the Galactic Empire, but also by the corporate sector. Droidekas on the black market were acquired for use in small armies and by some independent states. Yes, such things also existed during the Imperial period. Sometimes Droidekas were bought on the black market by planets within the Empire. For those deeply concerned and perplexed by the myth of Imperial dictatorship, we'll remind you that Imperials only changed the ruling power on one of the 80 planets. This figure in particular appears in both editions of the Imperial sourcebook and in later sources. On the rest of the planets, the old government remained in power, ruling by old rules and traditions. If you're not getting on the nerves of the central authority and Emperor Palpatine himself, then you can live peacefully and even maintain your own army and a small fleet to defend against pirates. Droidekas were acquired by small colonies somewhere far away in the galaxy, but there were very few of them there. It's hard to say what condition they were in. Usually on the Outer Rim there were fewer experienced mechanics and programmers than there were well-fed rankers and conscientious Hutts. But since Droidekas are mentioned there and could somehow fight, they were still being serviced in some way. The novel Survivor's Quest discusses the use of droids in military operations. One of the characters argues that the idea of using droids in the army is outdated, especially in the Empire of the Hand. In response, it is pointed out that in certain regions of the New Republic, droids are still actively used, especially on undeveloped planets where they protect the population from wild animals. The events take place 22 years after the Battle of Yavin, 3 years after the end of the Galactic Civil War. Droidekas in the service of some states and very rare droidekas preserved among the Imperial remnants even managed to fight with the Yuuzhan Vong, although not as successfully as the B-2 model droids. They were even awarded a collective combat medal for this. So, we've got such a long and fascinating story here. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye.